In 1962, America's highest-ranking military officers approved a plan to stage attacks, blame Cuba, and manufacture public support for war. This is not a theory. The government's own files prove it. By the end, you'll know what Operation Northwoods proposed, how close it came to the White House, and why the most disturbing part isn't what officials wanted Americans to believe, but what they were prepared to create. To understand Northwoods, you have to enter Washington after the Bay of Pigs. It is 1961. A CIA-backed invasion of Cuba has collapsed. Fidel Castro remains in power, just 90 miles from Florida, and the Soviet Union has gained a highly visible ally in the Western Hemisphere. Inside the Pentagon, removing Castro is still treated as an urgent objective. But there is a problem. Invading Cuba without a clear provocation could make the United States look like the aggressor. The American public might resist. Allied governments might refuse support. The United Nations could condemn the attack. Military planners therefore begin working backward. If war requires public outrage, then what kind of incident would produce it? That question shifts the mission. They are no longer planning only how to defeat an enemy. They are considering how to create the political conditions that would make attacking that enemy possible. The project receives a bland code name, Northwoods. On March 13, 1962, General Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, signs a memorandum forwarding the proposals to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. Its title is bureaucratic, Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. But the purpose is remarkably direct. The document says the recommended actions could place the blame for hostile acts on Cuba, creating international support for American military intervention. Notice what that means. The planners are not describing how to respond if Cuba attacks. They are compiling incidents that could be made to appear Cuban. This was not an anonymous fantasy mailed to Washington. It emerged from the Joint Chiefs planning process and carried the approval of America's senior uniformed leadership. The most dangerous ideas often arrive without drama, typed neatly, numbered carefully, and passed upward in a folder. Northwoods proposed building what it called a coordinated series of incidents. One scenario centered on the American naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Friendly Cubans could be dressed in enemy uniforms. Ammunition could be exploded. Fires could be started. Aircraft could be sabotaged. Mortar shells could fall near the base. The document even suggested capturing supposed saboteurs and preparing fraudulent evidence to establish Cuban responsibility. Another proposal was brutally simple: blow up an American ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba. The planners compared its potential emotional impact to the sinking of the USS Maine, the explosion that helped drive the United States toward war with Spain in 1898. History had already demonstrated the power of a destroyed ship, grieving families, and a furious public. Northwoods treated that emotional chain reaction almost like an engineering formula: incident, accusation, outrage, war. But the planning did not remain confined to a military base. Northwoods discussed developing a campaign of terrorism in Miami, elsewhere in Florida, and even Washington. The document proposed sinking a boat carrying Cuban refugees, whether real or simulated, and staging attacks against Cuban exiles in the United States. Explosives could be planted. People could be wounded. Arrests could follow. Prepared documents could then be released to connect the violence to Castro's government. This is where the story becomes harder to keep at a comfortable distance. The targets were not abstract points on a map. The plan depended on frightened civilians, alarming headlines, and a population made to feel that the enemy had already crossed into American streets. But before we get to the operation's most elaborate deception, you need to understand something even stranger. The planners were not merely discussing a false story. They designed a mechanism for manufacturing physical reality around it. Imagine a civilian airliner leaving the United States with college students on board. Its flight plan crosses near Cuba. Somewhere along the route, the aircraft appears to report an attack. A distress message reaches the airwaves, then the plane disappears. To the world, Cuba has destroyed an American passenger aircraft. But in the Northwoods proposal, the passengers would actually be traveling under carefully arranged identities. The original aircraft could be replaced by an unmanned duplicate. The passenger plane would secretly land at a military facility while the drone continued along the public flight path. Near Cuba, the unmanned aircraft would broadcast a rehearsed emergency transmission claiming it was under attack. It would then be destroyed by radio signal. Civilian radio stations and international aviation channels would hear the final call. The deception would not rely upon a single government announcement. Independent listeners would unknowingly become witnesses, giving the fabricated attack the texture of truth. Here is the contradiction: some scenarios were designed to avoid actual deaths. That sounds reassuring, until you see why. A simulated funeral could still produce photographs. Empty seats could still represent victims. Fabricated passenger lists could still give newspapers names, hometowns, and grieving biographies. The planners understood that public perception did not require the event itself to be real. It required believable fragments, wreckage, radio traffic, casualty reports, witnesses, and official statements that reinforced one another. Northwoods also suggested using American fighter aircraft painted to resemble Cuban MiGs. These disguised planes could harass civilian aircraft or attack unmanned American drones, creating apparent evidence of Cuban aggression. Each false signal would validate the next. The document was building something we would now call an information environment, except this environment would be constructed from military assets, manipulated communications, and staged violence. Now the central reveal. Operation Northwoods was not primarily a plan to fool Cuba. It was a plan to persuade you. Its true battlefield was public belief. The memorandum explains that the desired result was to place the United States in the apparent position of suffering defensible grievances from a rash and irresponsible Cuban government. Apparent is the crucial word. The proposed incidents would create a narrative in which American military action looked reluctant, lawful, and necessary. Cuba would appear to have forced Washington's hand. That is why the operation included more than explosions. It required casualty lists, planted evidence, intercepted communications, funerals, press coverage, and diplomatic reactions. The objective was not simply to start a conflict. It was to control the moral sequence leading into it. First, America appears to be attacked. Then the public demands action. Finally, invasion becomes framed not as a choice, but as the only possible response. Northwoods was never carried out. The proposals went to McNamara and were rejected by the Kennedy administration. There is no evidence that President Kennedy personally approved them, or that the plan progressed into an active operation. That distinction matters. These were proposed scenarios, not completed attacks. Treating them as proof that every later tragedy was staged would go beyond the evidence. But dismissing Northwoods as meaningless would also miss the warning. America's senior military chiefs had unanimously approved presenting these concepts for consideration. The institutional safeguards did eventually hold, but only after the ideas had been developed, written, reviewed, and transmitted upward. General Lemnitzer's term as chairman ended later in 1962. He subsequently became NATO's supreme Allied commander in Europe. The document disappeared into classified files. The immediate danger passed, while the public remained unaware that such a boundary had ever been approached. For roughly 35 years, ordinary Americans could not read the Northwoods record. The relevant files became public in the 1990s through releases connected to the review of Kennedy assassination records. Researchers and journalists then brought the proposals into wider view. That timing created a final, unsettling effect. By the time the public could examine the pages, the Cold War had ended. Cuba no longer occupied the same terrifying position in American life. Most of the officials involved were gone. The political moment in which the plan could have mattered had vanished. Declassification revealed the truth, but too late for democratic scrutiny when scrutiny was most necessary. And that may be the deeper lesson of suppressed history. A government can eventually release an explosive document and claim transparency. Yet if disclosure comes decades after the decisions, the public gains knowledge without power. You can judge the plan, but you cannot question its authors while the machinery is still moving. Operation Northwoods does not prove that every official account is false. It proves something more precise, and more useful. Under enough geopolitical pressure, respected institutions can generate proposals that violate the principles they claim to defend. Not because everyone involved is irrational, but because closed systems can turn moral questions into logistical ones. Could an incident be staged? Could blame be assigned? Could outrage be converted into military authorization? Inside the document, those questions appear orderly. Outside it, they describe the attempted manipulation of an entire democracy. The lesson is not to believe every conspiracy. It is to demand evidence, preserve oversight, and become suspicious whenever leaders insist that an emotionally overwhelming event leaves no time for questions. Because Northwoods shows that sometimes the most incredible allegation is not invented by outsiders. Sometimes it is typed by officials, stamped top secret, and hidden until history can no longer stop it. If this broke your brain a little, subscribe. We drop one of these every week. And next time, we're opening another Cold War file that sounds completely impossible. The Glomar Explorer was built to steal a Soviet submarine, a covert mission disguised as an industrial project, financed in secrecy, and hidden beneath miles of ocean.